Located on a huge lot.
Natalia Pirig is a luxury real estate agent in Miami Beach. Her clients don't really ask her about sea level rise in the area. And if they do,
I didn't have anybody who would be concerned to the point that they wouldn't buy.
Mary Dreiling was born and raised in Miami Beach. Sea level rise hasn't affected her home yet, and she's not worried about it becoming a problem in the future.
The projections, some of them are pretty grim, though. Is that something that worries you at all?
No, I'm growing up here. To me, it's always been the same. I knew where the streets flooded and where they didn't.
For some, like Mary, who have lived around water their entire lives and are used to flooding, sea level rise is a slow-moving and abstract threat. But within 30 years, or the length of a mortgage term, 64,000 homes in Florida will be at risk of chronic flooding. And Miami Beach alone has 12,000 of those homes. We were down in Miami for this story before the pandemic, and while COVID has changed a lot of things, sea level rise isn't one of them.
In the king tides, in the spring and in the fall, this is the area where the water would come up through the storm pipes.
Even on a day like today?
Even on a day like today, you see a storm drain like that, the water would start to come in and then flood the area.
The city of Miami Beach has a $650 million 10-year plan to upgrade infrastructure in the face of sea level rise.
The main road is higher, but everything else is low.
So the road was elevated about 2 feet here.
Okay.
What you're looking at is the electrical panel, and on top you're looking at a generator. New seawall, new elevation.
Okay.
Older seawall,
old elevation.
Lower elevation.
But they don't want to lull people into a false sense of security.
I'm always very careful with the way I choose my words because I don't want people to fall into that complacency. It's not fixed. We're not done.
While Miami Beach explores the options, in other places, the only option is retreat.
There's marks around the neighborhood, how high the water was, and basically standing right here, we would all be underwater.
Frank Mozinski grew up in Ocean Breeze, Staten Island. He spent 40 years of his life there.
So that right there was my house. This was it. This was my piece of paradise.
Superstorm Sandy hit the neighborhood hard. Frank lost 2 of his neighbors.
You're never ready to leave your home that day and not be able to go back. The people that are paid to help us all failed us. Then this program came along, and there was a glimmer of hope because we seen another community did it.
He's talking about a buyout program led by the New York governor's office after Sandy.
And the community was willing pretty unanimously.
Pretty unanimously. It was totally voluntary, and it took a lot of work.
The buyout wasn't just about paying out the homeowners. The program aimed to make the entire area resilient.
Because we're going to make it so that no one will ever build there again, no one will get hurt there again, and it will make the areas further up from us more resilient.
But since it was voluntary, not everyone left.
Some people didn't take the buyout, and so they chose to stay. But they have to be willing to put up with anything that's going to come their way now.
I see it already happening now. We don't have to wait 10 or 20 years.
Klaus Jacob is a geophysicist.
Well, welcome in paradise.
With the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University.
We will see more frequent flooding at these low-lying elevations. I'm a living example of the dilemma whether to live in a flood zone or to move out of it. Where I am sitting right now, up to my hips during Sandy, there was water.
Some of his neighbors have been trying to sell their homes for years with no luck since they're in a flood zone.
There's a for sale sign here, there's one down there.
While others have tried to adapt.
Here we have a case where a house was so severely destroyed during Sandy that it was torn down and is now building a new one, of course, 10 foot up in the air. The problem is, can you get in and out of the house when you want? The house is safe, but their life may not be.
So what is the price people are willing to pay for paradise? It depends on who you ask.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.